Members, I was heartened by the ranking member's remarks, and I hope that means we can all agree that the full faith and credit of the United States should not hang in the balance every time there's a fiscal debate in Washington. H.R. 807 will strengthen and protect our nation's credit by assuring that debt service has first call on all incoming revenues. Even with record deficits, our revenues are roughly 10 times greater than the service on our public debt. So there is absolutely no excuse for a debt default. And this is not a radical suggestion. The Government Accountability Office has consistently held that the Treasury Secretary already has, quote, the authority to choose the order in which to pay obligations of the United States, end quote, to protect the nation's credit. Indeed, such authority is inherent in the 1789 Act that established the Treasury Department and entrusted it with management of the revenue and support of the public credit. This measure simply restates that existing authority and requires the Treasury Secretary to use it to protect the nation's credit. Most states already have similar laws. Last year, Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke credited these provisions for maintaining confidence in state and municipal markets in testimony he gave to the Senate, and he told the House Budget Committee that a similar measure at the federal level would help to protect against a default. And now, is this tacit acceptance of that the nation shouldn't pay its other bills? Well, does anyone suggest that all of the states that have similar provisions in their constitutions and statutes for hundreds of years have ever used them as an excuse not to pay their other bills? Of course not. On the contrary, Mr. Chairman, this provision to support their credit first actually supports and maintains their ability to pay all of their other obligations in the event of a default. Now, think about it this way. When you're depending on your credit cards to pay your bills, you better make sure that you make the minimum credit card payment first. That's what this bill does. Some say we ought to include other priorities like Social Security or payments to our troops, but of course once we start down that road, we run out of money before we run out of worthy programs, and Congress should not try to micromanage this process. More importantly, the fact is that the public credit is what supports Social Security and payments to troops and all of the other obligations, and this legislation ought to be focused on this central and fundamental imperative, to protect the public credit. Beyond that, we should leave it to the Treasury Secretary to set priorities according to the demands of the times. Now, opponents have said, well, this would put repaying China ahead of paying Grandma's Social Security. But more than half of the debt held by the public is held by Americans, including Grandma's pension fund. China holds only 11%. This bill protects American debt holders and assures that American pension funds won't be undermined in the event of a temporary fiscal stalemate in Washington. Again, this is not an endorsement of a prolonged stalemate over the debt limit or funding bills. Postponing the prompt payment of all of the government's bills would be unprecedented and dangerous. Although existing revenues could support critical government responsibilities for a while, distress to other federal employees and contractors would be severe, rapidly compounding, and eventually would threaten core governmental functions. It's something to be avoided at virtually all cost, except, of course, the cost of imperiling the nation's credit. We should remember that if the full faith and credit of the United States is ever compromised, all programs are jeopardized. We must also recognize that today our country is divided over fiscal policy, and protracted disputes in Congress over this policy are likely to continue for some time. Financial markets ought to be confident that their Treasury bonds are safe, regardless of what political storms may be raging in Washington.
Thank you, Mr. McClintock. Mr. Scalise, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Bustan.